Section 11 of the Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 1, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. Adelicia of Louvaine, Chapter 1, Part 1. This princess, to whom contemporary chroniclers have given the name the Fair Maid of Brabant, is one of the most obscure characters in the illustrious catalogue of English queens. Tradition and her handmaid poetry have, however, spoken bright things of her, and the surviving historical records of her life, though brief, are all of a nature tending to confirm the good report which the verses of the Provençals have preserved of her virtues and accomplishments. Descended, through both her parents, from the imperial Carlovingian line, Adelicia boasted the most illustrious blood in Christendom. She was the eldest daughter of Godfrey of Louvaine, Duke of Brabant and Lothiere, or Lower Lorraine, and Ida, Countess of Namur. Her father, as the great-grandson of Charles, brother to Lothaire of France, was the lawful representative of Charlemagne. The male posterity of the unfortunate Charles having been cut off by Hugh Capet, the rights of his house became vested in the descendants of his eldest daughter, Gerberga. Lambert, the son of Gerberga, by her marriage with Robert of Louvaine, was the father of Godfrey. Ermengarde, the second daughter of Charles, married Albert, the third count of Namur. Their sole daughter and heiress, Ida, the mother of Adelicia, became the wife of her cousin, Godfrey of Louvaine, surnamed Barbatus, or the Bearded, because he made a vow never to shave his beard till he had recovered Lower Lorraine, the patrimony of his ancestors. In this he succeeded in the year 1107, after which he triumphantly displayed a smooth chin, in token that he had fulfilled his obligation, and finally obtained from his subjects and contemporaries the more honourable appellation of Godfrey the Great. The dominions of this prince were somewhat more extensive than the modern kingdom of Belgium, and were governed by him with the greatest wisdom and ability. From this illustrious lineage, Adelicia appears to have inherited the distinguished beauty and fine talents for which the Lorraine branch of the house of Charlemagne has ever been celebrated. She was also remarkable for her proficiency in feminine acquirements. A standard which she embroidered in silk and gold for her father, during the arduous contest in which he was engaged for the recovery of his patrimony, was celebrated throughout Europe for the exquisite taste and skill displayed by the royal Adelicia in the design and execution of her patriotic achievement. This standard was unfortunately captured at a battle near the castle of Duras, in the year 1129, by the Bishop of Liege and the Earl of Limburg, the old competitor of Godfrey for Lower Lorraine, placed by them, as a memorial of their triumph, in the great church of St. Lambert, at Liege, and was for centuries carried in procession, on rogation days, through the streets of that city. The church of St. Lambert was destroyed during the French Revolution, yet the learned editor of the Howard Memorials fondly indulges in the hope that this interesting relic of his royal ancestress's female skill and patriotic feeling may be still in existence, and destined perhaps hereafter to be brought to light, like the long-forgotten Bayeux tapestry. The plain where this memorable trophy was taken is still called the Field of the Standard. The fame of the Fair Maid of Brabant's charms and accomplishments, it is said, induced the confidential advisers of Henry I of England to recommend their sorrow-stricken lord to wed her, in the hopes of dissipating that corroding melancholy which, since the loss of his children in the fatal White Ship, had become constitutional to him. The temper of the monarch had, in fact, grown so irascible, that his greatest nobles feared to enter his presence, and it is said that, in his causeless transports of rage, he indulged himself in the use of the most unkingly terms of vituperation to all who approached him, which made his peers the more earnest in their counsels for him to take a second wife. Adelicia of Louvaine was the object of his choice. Henry's ostensible motive in contracting this marriage was the hope of male posterity, to inherit the united realms of England and Normandy. He had been a widower 2 years, when he entered into a treaty with Godfrey of Louvaine for the hand of his beautiful daughter. Robert of Gloucester, when recording the fact in his rhyming chronicles, says, "He knew no woman so fair as she was seen on middle earth." The name of this princess has been variously written by the chroniclers of England, Normandy, Germany, and Brabant, as Adeliza, Alicia, Adelaide, Aleida, or Adelheid, which means most noble. In the Saxon Chronicle she is called Athalice, or Alice. Mr. Howard of Corby Castle, the immediate descendant of this queen, in his Memorials of the Howard family, calls her Adelicia for the best reasons. Her name is so written in an original charter of the 31st of Henry I, confirming her grant of lands for the foundation of a hospital of lepers at Fuglestone, near Wilton, dedicated to St. Giles, which deed, with part of the seal appendant, is still preserved in the corporation chest at Wilton. The Provençal and Walloon poets, of whom this queen was a munificent patroness, style her Alix la Belle, Adelaise, and Alice, varying the syllables according to the structure of the verses which they composed in her honor, a license always allowed to poetical writers. Therefore, the rhymes of the troubadours ought not to be regarded as the slightest authority in settling the point. Modern historians generally speak of this princess by her Latinized name of Adeliza, but her learned descendant's version of her name is that which ought to be adopted by her biographer. There is no authentic record of the date of Adelicia's birth. Mr. Howard supposes she was about 18 years old at the period of her marriage with Henry I, and it is certain that she was in the bloom of her beauty at the time he sought her hand. In proportion to the estimation in which the charms of Adelicia were held, did Henry fix her dower, which was so munificent that the Duke of Louvaine, her father, scrupled not to consign her to her affianced lord, as soon as the contract of marriage was signed. This ceremony took place on the 16th of April, 1120, but the nuptials were not celebrated till some months after this period. King Henry, in person, conducted his betrothed bride to England in the autumn of this year. They landed about Michaelmas, and, according to some historians, the royal pair were married at Ely soon after their arrival. But if so, it must have been a private arrangement, for the nuptials were publicly solemnized at Windsor on the 24th of January, 1121, having been delayed in consequence of a singular dispute between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Salisbury, which established a point too important to be omitted in a history embracing in a peculiar manner the habits and customs of royalty. Roger le Poer, the Bishop of Salisbury, that notable preacher of short sermons, claimed the right to marry the royal couple because the fortress of Windsor was within his diocese. This right was disputed by the aged Ralph, Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a great stickler for the prerogatives of his office, and an ecclesiastical council was called, in which it was decided that wherever the king and queen might be within the realm of England, they were the parishioners of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Accordingly, the ceremony was triumphantly performed by the venerable primate, though bowed down by so many infirmities, that he appeared like one tottering on the verge of the grave. This afforded Henry an excuse for deputing the honour of crowning him and his fair young bride, on the following day, at Westminster, to his favourite prelate, Roger le Poer, the Bishop of Salisbury, above named, to console him for his disappointment with regard to the hymeneal office. But the Archbishop was not thus to be put off. The right of crowning the king and queen he considered a still more important branch of his archiepiscopal prerogatives than that of marrying them, and malgré his age and paralysis, he hastened to the abbey, where the ceremonial had commenced at an unusually early hour. Roger le Poer having, according to his old custom, made unprecedented expedition in the performance of his office, had already placed the royal diadem on the monarch's brow, when Archbishop Ralph sternly approached the royal chair and asked Henry, "Who had put the crown on his head?" The king evasively replied, "If the ceremony had not been properly performed, it could be done again." on which, as some chroniclers assert, the choleric old primate gave the king such a smart blow with his crosier that he smote the crown from his head. But Edmer says, he only raised it up by the strap which passed under the chin, and so turned it off his head. He then proceeded to replace it with all due form, and afterwards crowned the fair young queen. This most extraordinary coronation took place on Sunday, January 30th, 1121. The beauty of the royal bride, whom Piers of Langtoft calls the May without vice, made a great impression on the minds of the people, which the sweetness of her manners, her prudence and mild virtues, strengthened in no slight degree. It was on the occasion of her bridal coronation that Henry of Huntingdon, the chronicler, addressed to Adelicia those celebrated Latin verses, of which Camden has given us the following translation. When Adelisa's name should grace my song, a sudden wonder stops the muse's tongue. Your crown in jewels when compared to you, how poor your crown, how pale your jewels show. Take off your robes, your rich attire remove, such pomps may load you, but can ne'er improve. In vain your costly ornaments are worn, you they obscure, while others they adorn. Ah, what new lustres can these trifles give, which all their beauty from your charms receive? Thus I, your lofty praise, your vast renown, in lowly verse I am not ashamed to have shown. Oh, be you not ashamed my services to own. The wisdom of this lovely girl queen early manifested itself in the graceful manner by which she endeavoured to conform herself to the tastes of her royal lord, in the encouragement of the polished arts, and the patronage of literature. Henry's love for animals had induced him to create an extensive menagerie at Woodstock, as we have seen, during the life of his first queen, Matilda of Scotland, who was probably well acquainted with natural history. The youthful Adelicia evidently knew nothing of zoology previously to her marriage with Henry Beauclerc, but, like a good wife, in order to adapt herself to his pursuits, she turned her attention to that study, for we find Philippe de Thuan wrote a work on the nature of animals for her special instruction. The poetical naturalist did not forget to allude to the personal charms of his royal patroness in his courtier-like dedication. Philippe de Thuan, en français raison, a de strait bestiaire, un livre de grammaire, pour l'or d'une femme qui moult est belle, Alix est nommée, Reine est cornier, Reine est d'Angleterre, ja Gumer. Philippe de Thuan, in plain French, has written an elementary book of animals, for the praise and instruction of a good and beauteous woman, who is the crowned queen of England and named Alix. One of the most approved historians of her day, the author of the Waltham Abbey manuscripts, states of himself that he was appointed a canon of Waltham Abbey through the patroness of Queen Adelicia. This chronicler is the same person who has so eloquently described the dismal search made for Harold's body after the battle of Hastings. Adelicia was deprived of the society of her royal husband a few weeks after their marriage, in consequence of a formidable inbreak of the Welsh, who had entered Cheshire, and committed great ravages. Henry went in person to the defence of his border counties, and having defeated the invaders, pursued them far into the country. During this campaign his life was in some peril, while separated from the main body of his troops, in a narrow defile among the mountains, where he fell into an ambush, and at the same time an arrow, which was aimed at him from the heights above, struck him on the breast, but rebounded from his armour of proof. Henry, who probably did not give his Cambrian foes credit for that skill in archery for which his Norman followers were famed, intimated his suspicions of treachery among his own people by exclaiming, "By our Lord's death, it was no Welsh hand that shot that arrow!" This narrow escape, or perhaps a wish of returning to Adelicia at Winchester, induced the king to conclude a peace with the Welsh. A very brief season of domestic intercourse was, however, permitted to the royal pair. Fulk, Earl of Anjou, having espoused his younger daughter Sybil to William Clito, the Earls of Mellant and Montfort, with a considerable party of the baronage of Normandy, openly declared themselves in favour of that prince, the heir of their lawful duke, Robert Courthose. Henry I. was keeping the Easter festival with his beautiful young queen at Winchester, when the news that Fulk of Anjou had joined this formidable confederacy reached him. He sailed for Normandy in April 1123, and Adelicia was left, as her predecessor, Matilda of Scotland, had often been before her, to hold her lonely courts during the protracted absence of her royal consort, and to exert herself for the preservation of the internal peace of England, while war or state policy detained the king in Normandy. Adelicia, following the example of her popular predecessor, Matilda, the good queen, in all that was deserving of imitation, conducted herself in a manner calculated to win the esteem and love of the nation, using her queenly influence for the establishment of good order, religion, and refinement, and the encouragement of learning and the arts. The king was absent from England 3½ years, before the expiration of which time Adelicia joined him in Normandy. Henry had defeated his enemies at the battle of Terode, near Rouen, and taken a merciless vengeance on the revolted vassals of Normandy, who were so unfortunate as to fall into his hands. His treatment of the luckless troubadour knight, Luc de Barre, though the circumstances are almost too dreadful for repetition, bears too strongly on the manners and customs of the 12th century to be omitted. Luc de Barre had, according to the testimony of Orduricus Vitalis, been on terms of the greatest familiarity with Henry Beauclerc in the days of their youth, but, from some cause, had joined the revolt of the Earl of Milent in the late insurrection, and the said earl, and all the confederate peers allied against Henry's government in Normandy, had been wonderfully comforted and encouraged by the Cervantes or war songs of Luc. These songs were provokingly satirical, and, being personally levelled against Henry, contained, we should suppose, some passages which involved a betrayal of confidence, for Henry was so bitterly incensed that when the luckless poet was made prisoner at the battle of Terode, he barbarously condemned his former friend to lose his eyes on a scaffold by the hands of the public executioner. This sentence was greatly lamented by the court, for Luc de Barre was not only a pleasant and jocose companion, but a gentleman of courage and honour. The Earl of Flanders interceded for the wretched victim. "No, sir, no," replied Henry, "for this man being a wit, a bard, and a minstrel, forsooth, hath composed many ribald songs against me, and sung them to raise the horse laughs of mine enemies. Now it hath pleased God to deliver him into mine hands. Punished he shall be, to deter others from the like petulance." The sentence therefore took place, and the hapless poet died of the wounds he received in struggling with the executioner. The Provençal annalists, however, declare that the gallant troubadour avoided the execution of Henry's sentence by dashing his head against the wall, which caused his death. So much for the punishment of libels in the 12th century. The Saxon Chronicle specifies that Queen Adelicia returned to England, September 1126, accompanied by King Henry and his daughter, the Empress Matilda, the heiress presumptive of England, then a widow, in her 24th year. According to Malmesbury and other several contemporary historians, strange and mysterious reports were in circulation throughout Europe, connected with the death, or rather we should say the disappearance of Matilda's imperial spouse, for it was affirmed that he was not dead, though his obsequies had been performed with all due solemnity, and a stately monument was raised to his memory in the Cathedral of Spires. Ever since the miserable death of his unhappy father, Henry IV., the Emperor Henry V. had been subject to great mental disquiet, from the remorse which perpetually deprived him of rest. One night, says William of Malmesbury, he rose up from the side of the Empress, and taking his staff in hand, with naked feet he wandered forth into the darkness, clad only in a woolen garment, and was never again seen in his own palace. This wild tale is repeated by Hoveden, Giraldus, and Higden, and is confirmed by various ancient manuscript chronicles, besides Trevisa, who adds, by way of sequel to the legend, that the conscience-stricken emperor fled to England, where at Westchester he became a hermit, changing his name to God's Call, or the Called of God, He lived in daily penance for the space of 10 years, and was buried in the cathedral church of St. Werburga the Virgin. The Empress Matilda, after the funeral of her august spouse at Spires in 1125, took possession of his imperial diadem, which she brought to England, together with a treasure which, in those days, was by some considered of even greater importance, the hand of St. James. Matilda was reluctant to leave Germany, where she was splendidly dowered, and enjoyed a remarkable share of popularity. The princes of the empire were so much charmed by her prudent conduct and stately demeanour, that they entreated the king, her father, to permit her to choose a second consort from among her august body, promising to elect for their emperor the person on whom her choice might fall. King Henry, however, despairing of a male heir, as he had been married to Adelicia 6 years, reclaimed his widowed daughter from the admiring subjects of her late consort, and carried her with him to England. Soon after their arrival, Henry summoned a parliament for the purpose of causing the Empress Matilda to be acknowledged as the heiress presumptive to the crown. This was the first instance that had occurred, since the consolidation of the Heptarchy under one supreme head, of a female standing in that important position with regard to the succession of the English crown. There was, however, neither law nor precept to forbid a female from holding the regal office, and Henry failed not to set forth to the representatives of the great body of the people, who had been summoned on this important business, his daughter's descent from their ancient line of sovereigns, telling them, that through her, who was now his only heir, they should come to be governed again by the royal English blood, if they would make oath to secure her, after his death, the succession as Queen of England, in case of his decease without a male heir. It is doubtless, on the authority of this remarkable passage in Henry's speech, that historians have called his first wife, Matilda of Scotland, the heiress of the Saxon line. This is worthy of observation. The people of England joyfully acceded to Henry's proposition, and the nobles and prelates of the Norman aristocracy, then assembled in council on this occasion, swore fealty to the high and mighty Lady Matilda as their future sovereign. Stephen, Earl of Mortain, the king's favourite nephew, being the third son of the Conqueror's fourth daughter, Adela, Countess of Blois, was the first who bent his knee in homage to the daughter of his liege lord, as the heiress of England, and swore to maintain her righteous title to the throne of her royal father. Stephen was the handsomest man in Europe, and remarkable for his fine carriage and knightly prowess. He bore great sway in the councils of his royal uncle, and was a general favourite of the nobles of England and Normandy. It has been said withal, that his fine person and graceful manners made a deep impression on the heart of the widowed heiress of England. The royal family kept Christmas this year at Windsor, but the Empress Matilda did not grace the festivities by her presence, but remained in the deepest seclusion, abiding continually, says Matthew Paris, in the chamber of Adelicia, by which it appears that notwithstanding her high rank and matronly dignity as the widow of an emperor, the heiress of England had no establishment of her own. This retirement, lasting for several months, gave rise to many mysterious reports as to the cause of her being hidden from the people, who had so recently been required to swear fealty to her as their future sovereign. By some it was said, that the king her father suspected her of having accelerated the death of her late husband, the emperor, or of causing him to be spirited away from his palace. But that was evidently a groundless surmise, for Gemiticensis, a contemporary chronicler, bears testimony to her prudent and gracious behaviour to her imperial spouse, which, he observes, was one of the causes which won the esteem of the German princes, who were urgent in their entreaties to her royal father for her restoration. This Henry pertinaciously refused, repeating, that she was his only heir, and must dwell among her own people. Yet early in the following year, he again bestowed her in marriage, without the consent of his peers of parliament, and decidedly against her own inclination, on a foreign prince, whom she regarded with the most ineffable scorn, as her inferior in every point of view. We have seen that, in her tender infancy, Matilda was used as a political puppet, by her parent, to advance his own interest without the slightest consideration for her happiness. Then the victim was led a smiling sacrifice to the altar, unconscious of the joyless destiny to which parental ambition had doomed her. Now the case was different. It was no meek infant, but a royal matron, who had shared the imperial throne of a Kaiser, and received for many years the homage of vassal princes. Moreover, she whom Henry endeavoured to compel to an abhorrent marriage of state possessed a mind as inflexible as his own. The disputes between the king and his daughter must have arisen to a very serious height before he took the unpopular step of subjecting her to personal restraint, by confining her to the apartment of his queen. Matthew Paris, indeed, labours to convince us that there was nothing unreasonable in this circumstance. Where, he says, should an empress live rather than with a queen, a daughter than with a mother, a fair lady, a widow, and the heir of a great nation, than where her person might be safest from danger, and her conduct from suspicion? The historian, however, forgets that Matilda was the stepdaughter of the queen, that Adelicia was not older than herself, and, from the acknowledged gentleness of her disposition, unlikely to assume the slightest maternal control over the haughty heiress of England. Adelicia must have felt herself very delicately situated in this business, and it appears probable that she acted as a mediator between the contending parties, conducting herself rather as a loving sister than an ambitious step-dame. The accomplished editor of the Howard Memorials infers that a very tender friendship existed between the Empress Matilda and Adelicia through life, which probably had commenced before the fair maid of Brabant was selected from among the princesses of Europe to share the crown of England with Henry I. For Matilda's imperial spouse, the Emperor Henry V, had been actively instrumental in assisting Godfrey Barbatus, the father of Adelicia, in the recovery of Lower Louvaine, an obligation which the Louvaine princess certainly endeavoured to repay to his widow. Adelicia's uncle, Reydon of Louvaine, afterwards Pope Callistus II, was at one period Bishop of Vienna, and it was even possible that Henry's attention was first attracted to the fair maid of Brabant at the court of his daughter, and the previous intimacy between the ladies may account for the fact that the haughty Matilda lived on such good terms with her stepmother, for Adelicia appears to have been the only person with whom she did not quarrel. The prince to whom Henry I had pledged the hand of his perverse heiress was Geoffrey Plantagenet, the eldest son of his old antagonist, Fulk, Earl of Anjou, and brother to the widowed princess, who had been espoused to Matilda's brother, William the Atheling. Geoffrey Plantagenet, the heir of Anjou, had been the favourite companion of King Henry I when on the continent. His fine person, his elegant manners, great bravery, and above all, his learning, made his society very agreeable to the monarch who still possessed these excellencies in great perfection. He chose to become the sponsor of Geoffrey in chivalry, and at his own expense had had the high ceremony performed at Rouen. After the bath into which, according to the ancient custom, the young chevalier was plunged, Henry gave him, as his godson in arms, a Spanish steed, a steel coat of mail, and cuisses a double proof against both lance and arrow, spurs of gold, a scutcheon adorned with golden lions, a helmet enriched with jewels, a lance of ash with a poitier's head, and a sword by Gallard, the most famous of the ancient armourers. Some of the French chroniclers declare this Geoffrey to be the first person that bore the name of Plantagenet, for putting in his helmet a plume of the flowering broom when he went to hunt in the woods. The King of England did not confine himself to this chivalric adoption. He was resolved that this accomplished favourite should become his son-in-law. There were, moreover, strong political reasons, in Henry's opinion, for this union. Fulk of Anjou, who had hitherto supported the claims of his gallant young son-in-law, William Clito, to the dukedom, was willing to abandon his cause, provided Henry would marry Matilda to his heir. This Henry had engaged to do, without the slightest attention to his daughter's feelings. His favourite nephew, Stephen of Blois, who is said to have rendered himself only too dear to the imperial widow, was, unfortunately for both of them, a married man at that time, or the long and ruinous civil wars that desolated England during his usurpation, might have been averted by a matrimonial alliance. The ceremony of betrothment between the reluctant Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou took place on Whitsunday, 1127, and she was, after the festivities of Whitsuntide were over, conducted into Normandy by her half-brother, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, and Brian, son of Alan Fergeant, Earl of Richmond, with great pomp. The feasts and pageants that attended her arrival in Normandy were prolonged during 3 weeks. On the first day, heralds in grand costume went through the streets and squares of Rouen, shouting at every crossway this singular proclamation: "Thus saith King Henry, let no man here present, whether native or foreign, rich or poor, high or low, warrior or rustic, be so bold as to stay away from the royal rejoicings, for whosoever shall not take a part in the games and diversions shall be considered guilty of an offense to our lord the king." King Henry had given positive commands to Matilda and her illustrious escort that the nuptials should be solemnized by the Archbishop of Rouen immediately on her arrival, but he was himself compelled to undertake a voyage to Normandy in August, to see the marriage concluded, which did not take place till the 26th of that month, from which we may reasonably infer that the reluctant bride paid very little attention to his directions. The affair was at length, however, accomplished to Henry's satisfaction, more especially as Fulk of Anjou, being called to the throne of Jerusalem by the death of Baldwin II., his father-in-law, resigned his patrimonial territories to his heir. Yet there were many circumstances that rendered this alliance a fruitful source of annoyance to Henry. The Anglo-Norman barons and prelates were highly offended, in the first place, that the king should have presumed to marry the heiress out of the realm without consulting them on the subject, and the people of England were no less displeased at the open violence that had been put on the inclinations of the descendant of their ancient sovereigns in this foreign marriage. As for Matilda, it should seem that she did not consider herself by any means bound to practice the duty of obedience, or even of common courtesy, to a husband who had thus been forced upon her against her own will, and while she extracted the most unqualified submissions from her luckless helpmate, she perpetually wearied her father with her complaints of his conduct. Queen Adelicia was rejoined by King Henry in the autumn, and they kept Christmas together in London. Early in the following spring, 1128, he was again compelled to embark for Normandy, to defeat the enterprising designs of his nephew, William Clito, who, having succeeded to the earldom of Flanders, in right of his grandmother Matilda, the wife of William the Conqueror, was enabled to assume a more formidable attitude than he had yet done. But this gallant and unfortunate prince met with his death in consequence of a slight wound in the thumb, which he took in disarming a mutinous soldier of his lance. He died 6 days later, in the monastery of St. Bertin, July 27, 1128. This formidable rival being now removed, Henry appeared at the summit of his ambition, and was considered the mightiest monarch of the West. He was the husband withal of one of the most beautiful and amiable princesses in Europe. Whether the fair Adelicia loved her royal spouse, history has not recorded, but her conduct as a wife, a queen, and even as a stepmother, was irreproachable. When all circumstances are considered, it can scarcely be imagined, however, that her splendid marriage was productive of happiness to the youthful wife of Henry I. To say nothing of the disparity in years between this illustrious pair, the morbid sorrow of which Henry was the perpetual prey after the loss of his children in the White Ship, the irascibility of temper to which he gave way in his old age, and his bitter disappointment in the want of offspring from his second marriage, must have been most distressing to the feelings of his gentle consort. Then the stormy disputes between Henry and his only daughter Matilda could not have been otherwise very painful to her. Whatever, however, were the trials with which Alicia had to contend, she evidently supported them with silent magnanimity, and at the same time endeavoured to soothe and cheer the gloom of her wayward lord by attracting to the court the most distinguished poets and minstrels of the age, who repaid her liberal patronage by celebrating her virtues and charms. End of Section 11.